Welcome to the JBP Podcast, Season 4, Episode 76. We use stories to understand the world around us. It's the reason we appreciate a beautiful poem, or why our breath is taken away by a movie. Any great piece of music tells a story too, through the lyrics, of course, but through the instrumental arrangement too. Personally, I've noticed that parts of life are arranged in stories too, overlapping narratives for different aspects of your life, relationships, adventures. I find it particularly obvious during trying times. Those times feel like narratives. Part 1 of this compilation focuses on Season 4 conversations between Dad, Randall Wallace, Chloe Valdry, that episode's coming soon, and Angus Fletcher. I hope you enjoy this narrative. Also, if you want to stop hearing my voice reading ads throughout these episodes, check out jordanbpeterson.supercast.com. If you're listening on a podcast site like Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever else you're listening on, after sign up, it'll swap this free podcast for the paid version, the premium version, and you access it the same way as you usually do. It's a very nice setup. $10 per month or $100 per year. That's jordanbpeterson.supercast.com. It's also in the show notes. I hope you enjoy this episode.
We're still unwrapping. Well, we're certainly still unwrapping the Bible. We're still unwrapping Shakespeare. There's more depth there than we can understand explicitly. And so anything that uses character has that tremendous advantage. And then there's also this strange ability that some people have in spades to create fictional worlds that are of unbelievable profundity and power. And I mean, the greatest example of that in the last 30 years, in terms of sheer imaginative power, has got to be J.K. Rowling and the Harry Potter series, which, gripped the imagination of the entire planet for a decade and produced untold wealth and spread literacy everywhere as well. She had a remarkably creative imagination and something quite mysterious. And so you're fortunate enough to work at the marriage of ideas and drama.
Yes, and it's really interesting when you've spoken about Dostoevsky and others in some of your lectures. I'm fascinated by him and all the Russians. I studied Russian for 4 years in college and read some of these in the original. My Russian wasn't fluent enough for me to really, I had to grind through them, but Tolstoy, Chekhov, who was a doctor, a medical doctor, as well as a writer. So that congruence of a commitment, not just in terms of literature, but that he used his profession as a doctor to also inform him as a writer. He famously said, medicine is my wife and literature is my mistress. And when I tire of one, I spend time with the other. And Pushkin, who would write stories that were full of thought, but the story itself was bigger than any thought he could put around it. It was more resonant. It carried more. By the way, when I listened to your biblical series, it caused me to decide to read through the whole Bible. And just start to finish. And I grew up Southern Baptist. So ever since I could read, I've read the Bible virtually every day of my life. But I'd never read the Bible start to finish. And there were some books that, even when I was a religion major at university, I would get to some of the books and go, I can't stay awake for this book. I just got to move on. But when you really go through it and you see the Old Testament as this incredible saga of a people trying to find the rules that kept them together as a people, and who felt, if you disobey these rules, then it's going to end badly for us all. And the greatest the greatest violation is to erect altars to other gods.
Right? Worship false idols. Yeah.
That's the worst one. And then along comes Jesus, who is completely steeped in all of that Old Testament. I mean, he is profound in his knowledge of it. And he lives and does and says these things. But it's not like it's a philosophy. It's a narrative which I've studied a great deal, and I believe is largely historical, or I should say significantly historical. I believe these things did happen. And then you have St. Paul, who's trying to make sense of what happened. And it's mind-blowing to me. It's mind-blowing to read it as a whole and put it into perspective in that, having spent my life in church.
What's mind-blowing about it in part, I mean, and I try to speak of the Bible not from the perspective of a committed believer, and I have my reasons for that. I guess it's partly because I want to concentrate on what everyone can come to see as true, I suppose. Perhaps that's it. But it is remarkable that the Bible does, in fact, make a coherent narrative, because we don't understand that. It was written by a very diverse range of people over a span of time that we can perhaps not even imagine. It's very difficult to tell how old the oldest stories in Genesis, particular, are. The story of the fall and of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. They bear all the hallmarks of a previous oral tradition that would have existed in a relatively unchanged form for tens of thousands of years, and perhaps even longer than that. And so they're unbelievably ancient. And then parts of it obviously are newer, and the written parts are obviously newer than any tentative oral tradition. But you have at the bare minimum an unbelievably deep psychological document that weaves itself over centuries into a coherent story. And Northrop Frye, I would say, he's a Canadian literary critic, did more for me than any other particular thinker to help me understand the nature of the narrative. Because Frye, and I suppose he did the same thing, or I'm doing the same thing that he did, because he preceded me also at the University of Toronto. He assessed the Bible as a work of literature, as a narrative. And that to me was never any denigration, because narrative, a powerful narrative, and you talk about this when you talk about Braveheart, for example, because there isn't that much known about William Wallace historically, but you crafted a narrative that was true enough, let's say, to be unbelievably attractive to people and to motivate them very deeply, because it's an affecting movie. Well, and if it wasn't, it wouldn't have been so popular. And so there's a truth in narrative that I think is even deeper than historical truth. A truly profound narrative truth is like the average of a whole variety of historical truths. And so it's the essence of historical truth. So it's even more true than what we would consider, say, eyewitness history, because eyewitness history is it's one battle. And there's maybe an epic theme in that battle, but then imagine that you could look at 1,000 battles and you could extract out from that what was canonical about heroic victory across all 1,000 battles. You see something like that happening in the Old Testament, and the narrative thread is really quite deep. Societies emerge, formulate, fall off the path, worship false idols, collapse. Right. And then the same thing happens again, and the collapse happens. And the collapse happens because people become too prideful, the kings in particular. They don't listen to the voice of conscience. And a prophetic voice arises and says, you're wandering off the tried and true path, and you're going to be punished terribly for that. And generally speaking, the kings ignore that, and catastrophe breaks free. And you see, and in the Old Testament in particular, there's the promise of the ultimate state in some sense. There's utopian promises that run through it, the search for the promised land. And then so strangely, you see that transformed into something that's not really political in the New Testament. You see that the promised land becomes the nature of experience as a consequence of a particular form of moral being. And then perhaps that has political implications because people who acted like that would produce a particular state, but it's no longer the dream of establishing the state that will solve all problems. It's psychologized, and it's unbelievably profound. And that's, I think you can derive all of that from the biblical writings without even starting to move onto classically religious territory. And then that does beg the question, of course, is what does all that wisdom point to in the final analysis? And that's when the questions start to become religious.
Yes. Well, Jordan, that's the part to me that it takes it into a whole different realm, as you say. There's a quote from Mary Oliver that a friend shared with me recently. It's keep some room in your heart for the unimaginable. And I find that in a great story, in any great piece of art, that surprise is the central currency of its power. There's an element of, if you will, of revelation, if you will. And I think it was Paul Tillich, I'm not sure, who said that religion is man's way to God and is always erroneous, but revelation is God's way to man. Maybe it was Karl Barth. It's God's way to man and is always perfect. Well, there's a revelatory aspect to any great story. When you're telling someone a story and they didn't see coming what just happened, that's what makes them awake. That's what stabs them broad awake. In Braveheart, so many people said to me it was when the woman that William Wallace loves, when her throat is cut, that's when suddenly they knew they were not in a typical action movie. Even to the very end of Braveheart, there would have been many people in Hollywood, and were, who thought, well, this movie needs to end with his friends swinging in on vines and saving him. We can't end an expensive historical epic movie with a guy beheaded and disemboweled. But that was where it had to end for me. But how we get there and what it says surprised me and surprised the audience too. And in that, I would think, is how it becomes resonant. I was doing a charity screening of Braveheart a few years ago for the first time in 2 decades, to sit in a theater and actually see the movie screened, not on television, but projected in a theater, and doing it for a charity in Austin, Texas. And at the end of the movie, I walked up onto the stage to do a Q&A. And the first person who stood up was a young woman in the front row, 19 years old. So she wasn't born when Braveheart had come out. And I was surprised that she stood up first. And she said, Mr. Wallace, I don't have a question. I just want to tell you something. My fiance died 6 months ago. And before he died, he told me he wanted me to watch Braveheart so I would understand the way he loved me. And I had to stop. I couldn't go on for several minutes. It shocked me. It moved me. It surprised me.
You said that you write love stories, and I guess she put her finger on that, hey? Really
yes.
Profoundly.
And the idea that men want to be courageous. They want to be willing to sacrifice themselves for what's worth sacrificing for. And women want a man like that. Women want to, and they want to be participants in that story, in that same journey for themselves. And to me, it's narrative can give you that more than any abstract explanation of it. I mean, I don't mean to
no, there's
say.
a lot to unpack in that. I want to go back to your discussion of surprise. I mean, among people who assess information theory, there's a strong association between something that's informative and something that's surprising. If you can predict it, technically speaking, it doesn't contain any information. And so information always comes in the form of surprise, technically speaking. And we are wired to attend to what's informative because that's what updates and teaches us. And so then you said revelation comes in the form of surprise. And I would say that's virtually the case by definition, isn't it? Because imagine that you're viewing a narrative through a particular lens. You're in a cognitive perceptual structure, a frame of reference that you're using to track all the actions and to make sense of them and to make predictions. And if something unexpected happens, that means that you've just learned that that frame of reference is no longer applicable to the current circumstance. And so what that really does mean is that something transcendent, at least from the perspective of that current frame of reference, has in fact occurred, because so that's a mini miracle in some sense, right? Because
yes.
A miracle is something that doesn't obey the laws that you're currently following. That's one way of thinking about it. And so a surprising revelation is a mini miracle, and maybe it's because of that. It's reminiscent of the fact of the miraculous, generally speaking. But I would also say the narrative does something else if it's profound too. It doesn't just surprise you. It also gives you a new frame of reference instantly within which that surprise now makes sense. And if it doesn't, then you're left unsatisfied by the movie. You think, oh, because I've seen that often, particularly in movies. It doesn't seem to happen quite so much in novels, where the director and the writer will throw a whole variety of things up in the air. And it's really compelling. And then about 3/4 of the way through the movie, you think, it'll be really something if all of that gets tied together, and then it doesn't, right? It falls flat. It doesn't end in a manner that does justice to what's been set up. So, and that's a classic narrative structure, right? There's a stable state to begin with, and then something that disrupts it and throws everything into a state of chaos temporarily, and then the establishment of a new state. And a good story definitely does that for us and guides us through that and shows us that we're the thing that does that as well.
Well, like if you take an Agatha Christie movie or story, there'll be all of these clues, and then Hercule Poirot, or we have a term in screenwriting, we call it Irving the Explainer, will show up at the end of the movie to explain everything, and then it all fits together. And the Sherlock Holmes movies will often be that way too. To me, they become much less fun then. The fun is when you don't yet know the answers, but once it's explained, it no longer has any magic for me. An example would be when I was in college, and I was a singer-songwriter, and I worked with a friend who was a magician, and we would entertain at different gatherings, and he was great at sleight of hand with cards. He could do a trick right in front of your face with cards, and you'd be gobsmacked. And he would show me how he was doing it, and all of a sudden I'd go, "Oh, gee, that's just that's so simple, and how could I miss that?" And then he would do the same trick to someone else, and I would be watching the trick, and I would think, "Oh, he blew it. He slipped. He showed them they can see how it's done," and they were gobsmacked. They didn't understand how it was done, so they were amazed. But that to me is a difference about a story like, you say, the Agatha Christie, or they throw up a whole bunch of parts and they never come together. For a great story, it's one that you're left. It's vibrating in you, and you can't fully explain it. You just know it happened. I hate to keep referencing Braveheart, but I wanted to make a movie, and it was my first movie. I wanted to make a movie that would have people walk out of the theaters the way I walked out of theaters at different times in my life and would say, my life will never be the same after what I just experienced there. I mean, that's always been what I was looked for. And that happened with Braveheart. I had a huge, tough Scot, I mean, a burly, brawling, head-butting Scot come up to me after a screening of Braveheart and look at me with tears in his eyes and say, I will never forget that, not ever. And I think of like a story like Tolstoy wrote a tale called The Wood Felling, or The Wood Felling Party. And it was about some Russian soldiers who were fighting, I believe they were fighting Afghan or Muslim troops in Azerbaijan or in the mountains, but they've been in this cold, forbidding place for a long, long time. They've seen all sorts of death, and they've gone out to cut wood and firewood and load it into a wagon, and a sniper hits one of them in the leg and hits him in the body, and he's bleeding to death. And he knows he's dying, and they load him on the wood wagon to carry him back while he's still alive. But he grabs the lieutenant by the collar and says, there are letters from my wife in my boot. Take them and send them back to my wife so she'll have them. And the officer says, yeah, I will. But the dying man knows he won't, because he's seen many men die and just pitched into shallow graves, and there's just so much death. So he says, no, take them while I'm still alive, and then I know you'll do it. So the officer gives the order, and they strip off the man's boot and cut through his pant and unwrap the wrappings around his leg that he's done to keep warm. And there are the letters. But what the officer sees for the first time in months and months, maybe years, is the bare flesh of a man's leg, this white, sunless flesh. And it's that reminds him that this is a human being. And Tolstoy says he was struck with a terrible dread of the loss of life. And I thought, even I remember I was 18 when I read that this is what an artist does. You hold up to us when we've become immune to certain things. Like you watch in women, it's one time it's mini skirts, another time it's no bras, another time it's bare midriffs, another time it's something else. But you get used to something, so nothing makes you notice. And the artist looks for, well, what can I do that will make people notice, to say, look here.
See what's there rather than what you remember.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So there's that interplay with, okay, there is your perception in what you're looking at, what you expect, like the magic trick. If you're expecting one thing and you don't see it, or now you know the trick, so now you perceive, that's one part of it. The other part of it is, okay, now I have perceived something. How do I make sense of that? I mean, another thing that I've been doing is working on the story for the resurrection, which I've studied since I was in school. The resurrection has fascinated me more than anything else, in part because, as I think it's N.T. Wright would say, if you don't think the resurrection is preposterous, you're missing the point. The whole point is that this is beyond anything you could imagine. You said a few weeks ago, I was listening to your podcast, and believe it was with that brilliant, I think he's Canadian, who makes the icons.
Jonathan Pajot.
Oh, mind-blowing.
That was quite the conversation.
Yes, and Jonathan said that there's this outside of what we can imagine that is going on. And you said, yes, you would never make this up. If you make up this Jesus story, I even believe that.
Well, that's part of the problem with Marx's theory. that religion is the opiate of the masses. It's like, okay, fair enough, I get it, and it's actually a reasonably intelligent critique. You could say, well, if you wanted to enslave people and oppress them, then you could invent a story and you could use that as a manipulative technique. But then it seems to me that you'd want a story that was sort of maximally fantasy-like and attractive. And so then you're stuck with, well, why invent hell, for example? And then you can say, well, that's where you put your enemies, so that's kind of convenient. But if you take medieval experience seriously, it's quite obvious. There's a philosopher in Canada, Taylor, who wrote about this in a book called Sources of the Self. Medieval people took the idea of hell extremely seriously and tortured themselves with it, believed that the fruits of immorality were infinitely terrible. And well, that isn't something that you use as a childish defense against the world. In fact, fear of hell is actually more intense, I would say, in some sense, than fear of death. And I believe that. I think there are things that are, if the thing you're most afraid of is death, you haven't been very afraid, because there are things that are far more terrifying than death. And certainly, well, hell is among those. And I suppose that's the place that you're eternally tortured for your own immorality, maybe perhaps even defined by your own conscience. Anyways, you wouldn't invent that as something attractive to the masses. And there's much of religious thinking that's like that. It doesn't have the aspect of, there's too much burden in it for it to be pure escapist fantasy. There's too much, and there's too much about it that's incomprehensible for it to be like a conspiratorial machination. No, it doesn't. It's not a hypothesis that fits the data well at all.
Right.
Well, it's a limit case also in some sense. Like you talked earlier about, you said something about sacrifice, and that, well, people don't take the idea of sacrifice very seriously. I've looked at the development of the idea of sacrifice in the Old Testament, and one of the things I've come to realize is that one of the great human discoveries was actually that of sacrifice, because it was the discovery of the fact that you could modify the present so the future was different. So it signals the discovery of the future by humanity, the idea of sacrifice, because you become consciously aware, perhaps after acting it out for God only knows how long, that you can give up something that you're deeply committed to in the present, something of extreme value, and obtain something of even more value in the future. Yeah. And that's the discovery of an entire dimension, the temporal dimension. It's a cataclysmic discovery. It's on the same order as the emergence of self-consciousness. And then mysteries emerge out of that. So, well, some sacrifices work better than others. Well, why? Well, the reaction of being to sacrifice seems to be reflective of the nature of being. And that's definitely the case. Some sacrifices work and some don't, just like some games are playable and some aren't. And so sacrifice has value. Well, then the question starts to become, well, what's of the highest value that you should sacrifice for? And what is the ultimate sacrifice? And well, you can give up something that you own. You can give up something that you love. You can die for something, or you can sacrifice your entire life to it. And it seems to me that in some sense, the latter, the last of those, is the ultimate sacrifice, to give up your entire life for the sake of the highest ideal. And that is the ideal of humanity. And then that is the ideal of humanity. And that is what everyone admires. And that's what we all look for in stories. That's what compels us. You said, well, it's the basis of romantic attraction. And I believe that to be the case. That associated with generosity, right? To share the fruits of your sacrifice. And the question arises, well, what is the ultimate sacrifice and what would be the consequences of that? And that's obviously what's being investigated, let's say, in our religious thinking. In the New Testament, there's no doubt that that's what's being investigated. Is there a cosmic significance to the idea of sacrifice?
And I agree with that completely. And I believe that's what is at play when you're making the sacrifice. There's this other element of of faith in it. Like the person making the sacrifice is, instead of it just being a negotiation, central to the sacrifice, it seems to me, is a transforming commitment. That the person is being transformed, and what he is giving is transforming. It's like one of the most commonly quoted lines from Braveheart is, "Every man dies, not every man really lives." And I didn't, by the way, it's pet peeve of mine. Another line from Braveheart, besides just the scream of freedom that people do, that comes from the film, but is, "They may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom." And that quote is on the wall of the United States Air Force Academy, but under it is the name William Wallace, although William Wallace never said that. And I keep wanting to write the English department there and say, "Hey, listen, guys." But where that quote came from was me thinking, okay, is it ego? Is it pride? Is it stubbornness that keeps William Wallace in the dungeon, refusing to submit to the king, refusing to ask the king for mercy and maybe buy time in his life so he can survive a while longer? And the queen, the future queen, comes to him with that offer. And then she says, "You'll die, it'll be terrible." After he has said, "If I submit to him, if I cry out for mercy, then everything that is me is dead already." And she says, "You'll die, it'll be awful." And I was thinking, well, what can he answer to that? And that was, every man dies, not every man really lives. And it became that, and in thinking of, say, Jesus at Golgotha, that if you took a snapshot at Golgotha on the day Jesus was crucified and you said, who's the victor in this picture? You probably wouldn't be inclined to say the guy on the middle cross. But you might, if you stared at the picture long enough. You actually might see it. Human beings may recognize that this one here in this way was doing something beyond all understanding. And to me, writing a story isn't just me going, what will surprise the audience? It's, I am being surprised by the story as it's coming through to me. The most notable part of that in Braveheart was I reached the end of the story, and I can see this clearly now, although it was more than 25 years ago. The axe is falling toward William Wallace's throat. And I wrote that on the page. And then I thought, well, we can't see the axe contact his throat and sever his head. What do we see now? And then I thought, well, what about to look at this from the point of view of him? When he knows he has fractions of a second to live, what would he look for? Where would he turn his eyes? Would he look at the axe? What would he do? And he would know that his friends were there. So I wrote, in the last instant of his life, William Wallace turns his eyes to his friends, who were Stephen and Hamish. And I did not know Jordan until that instant, that there between them was her, the wife he had lost. And I wept. And I had no sense that anybody else was going to relate to that story. I have a friend named Jack Bernstein, who's a comedy writer. He wrote Ace Ventura, the original Ace Ventura. And Jack is different from me in almost every way. If you put our traits on paper, we're just polar opposites. And he's the one I always take my first drafts to and say, I know this is a mess, but is there anything here? And he read Braveheart, and we sat down to have breakfast and for him to give me his notes. And he said, this is the best thing of yours I've ever read. And I was completely blindsided. I had no sense that anybody would like it, that particularly him, that it had any value. But the story surprised me. And I think, therefore, that revelatory quality was alive. I think it happens in music. What makes music magical is not that it's if it's just the same beat, the same monotony, the same chord changes we've heard, the same lyrics we've heard, it doesn't open us up at all. But when it's just enough different that we notice the difference and are drawn into it. Now, if it's too different, when I was in school and took music classes and they're telling us about atonal this and that and abstract, it had no life, no heart at all. But when I listen to Beethoven, I can just feel the swelling of his heart, and here hundreds of years later.
Yes, well, you hear something great and you follow it, and then there's a move of genius, and out of that greatness comes something that's even greater. And you're so satisfied by that because you can see what's greater emerge from what's great, but you can also see that that's characteristic of humanity. You're participating in that.
Yes.
Emergence of what's better in this surprising manner.
Yeah. One of your new rules is to take a room and make it beautiful. Mm-hmm. And I love that. I love that rule. I mean, that it seems so simple, but that is one of the richest ones for me.
That's my favorite chapter of both books. I would say I'm happiest with that one.
Wow.
This episode was sponsored by Audible. Fewer and fewer people are actually reading books. The easiest way to get momentum is to start listening while you're doing chores or working out or walking. You get the idea. Audible has all the entertainment you could wish for in a single app. There's something for everyone on there, from bestsellers to memoirs to classics like my favorite, The Master and Margarita. They even have Dad narrating the Gulag Archipelago. What a time to be alive. Every month, members get access to one out of thousands of audiobooks, plus full access to a selection of Audible titles. Just download and stream wherever, whenever. There's a 30-day trial for newcomers as well. If you enjoy this podcast, it's hard to imagine you wouldn't enjoy listening to great books as well. Make a change in 2022. Visit audible.com/Peterson or text Peterson to 500-500. That's audible.com/Peterson or text Peterson to 500-500. This episode is also brought to you by Skillshare. I really like Skillshare. Skillshare has thousands of classes for you creative and curious types. They have a fascinating and seriously extensive catalog. You can learn about creative writing, film, fine art, business design, photography, freelancing, and more. The classes include video lessons, about 60 minutes each, and a class project to get you really involved. Skillshare fits any schedule or skill level. You get unlimited access to thousands of classes with a huge community of lifelong learners like you behind it. Skillshare is one of the best platforms I've seen that help teach people new skills. Skillshare can make your 2022 a year of exciting learning and personal growth with classes like Productivity for Creatives, Build a System that Brings Out Your Best. That sounds pretty good to me. So try this special offer and explore your creativity at Skillshare.com/Peterson and get a 1 month free trial. That's 1 month free only at Skillshare.com/Peterson.
Why term it the theory of enchantment? You're careful with your words. You obviously thought about that for a long time. And
yes.
So
yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I feel like the term enchantment came to me almost in passing. I was trying to figure out how to, and we don't have to get into the details of this. I'm happy to get into it if you'd like, but I was trying to teach people or figure out a framework that could teach people how to love each other in the agapic sense of the word. And then I began to ask myself, well, what are people already in love with? And so I ventured into pop culture because pop culture shows us what people are already in love with. And I started to study aspects of our popular culture, which included things like Disney films and Nike and Beyonce and all of these brands that have religious like devotion from their fans. And I was just why? What is happening there?
That's so interesting, because it means that you this is one of the problems I have with the rationalist atheist types. Like, it's a major problem. It's like, forget about the ontological claims of religion. And that isn't the issue in some sense, as far as I'm concerned. And this touches on your discussion of Descartes. It's like, people obviously have the capacity for religious experience. We have the capacity for awe. And you could say, well, awe isn't a religious experience. Well, that's a matter of definition, and we could play that game. But if the awe is deep enough, and it's a definitional issue, is for all intents and purposes, deep awe is religious, or we need another word that means the same as religious if we're going to talk about it. And you participate in that in dance and in music and in these popular stories, which is why I've been so interested in taking apart Disney films, for example. And they're very expensive productions. They're very labor intensive. The people of genius work on them. They have huge cultural impact, and they're extraordinarily popular. It's like, what's going on here exactly? And so it's definitely worth an analysis. And I think you're wise to start with, well, what is it that people are valuing, and why? It's an empirical observation in some sense. This is where they're deriving meaning and value. And the deep study of that is a religious study. And there's just no escaping that. So, okay. So you're looking at pop culture.
So I'm looking at pop culture, and I'm studying Disney and Beyonce and Apple and Nike and all of these brands. And I'm looking for a common theme to see if there's a common pattern across all of these. And the common pattern I'm seeing is that all of these brands are creating content where their audience sees themselves, their imperfect selves, and their potential reflected in the content, which is why they gravitate toward it. And so I'm seeing, in these Disney films that are motifs for the human condition, where this imperfect, flawed would-be hero has to go through a series of ups and downs and ups and downs and ups and downs to discover their potential self and emerge the hero. I'm seeing, almost every Nike ad being this narrative for this, sort of junior varsity athlete trying to become better and better and better at her craft, and then emerge in a spirit of excellence. I'm seeing Beyonce say things like "Who run the world," girls and women gravitating towards that because they see their potential reflected in those lyrics. And
it's a universal ideal that compels us to imitate, and that's what attracts our attention. And that pattern, to identify that pattern, is to look for what is truly religious. Because the pattern that underlies everything that compels us is the religious pattern. And it's the religious instinct that orients us towards that. And that is not an ontological claim about the structure of reality. I'm not saying anything about God. This is a different kind of conversation.
Right.
Now, that might point to God, and in some sense it most definitely does, but that isn't the same as the discussion about whether God exists from a propositional perspective.
Which would be the wrong question anyway, I would argue. But yeah, so I was seeing all of this emerge from the research that I was conducting. And then at the time, I also read a book called Enchantment, which was written by Guy Kawasaki, the former marketing director of Apple. And he defined enchantment as the process by which you delight someone, where a person sort of starts to open up to life. And life
it's enticement, an enticement, and an invitation.
An invitation, an attraction, so to speak. And he said that this can be present in a human being and a product and an idea. And he also said that Steve Jobs used this idea to design Apple products, to sort of figure out the aesthetic of what Apple products should look like. And meanwhile, the idea of enchantment correlates very closely with Disney, because Disney is, takes place in these enchanted forests and these magical kingdoms, and there's this underlying concept of enchantment. And so I just decided that enchantment seemed like the proper word to define this, or to describe this phenomenon by which we start to open up to the complexity of ourselves and thus to others, and which can give us a sense of a relational way of being, as opposed to a consuming way of being, right? Erich Fromm, the philosopher, wrote a number of essays on the difference between having and being, and how he talked about how in the West in particular, we have become caught up in this need to consume, where we define our identity according to how much we possess, according to how much we have, as opposed to our capacity to become wise, to be, right? Not to have, to be wise, to be mature.
And that should also be viewed with a tremendous amount of sympathy, because it wasn't that long ago when we were all like struggling to feed hand to mouth in the face of terrible privation and starvation.
That's very well said.
Yes. So that's another place to have some sympathy for hyper-consuming human beings. It's like, oh, look, we have enough. Oh, well, that's never happened before, ever. So now we don't really know what to do with this.
It's so true. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but that's very well said. And it's not like we don't need, we do have to have things, right, to survive. We have to have food and water and shelter, but we've fallen into what John Vervaeke calls this modal confusion, where we say, I want to be mature, so I need to have as many carbs as possible, right? So we're confusing the having mode with the being mode. So enchantment, the objective of enchantment, of the theory of enchantment, is to bring people back to this relational way of being, and to be in balance with the complexity of themselves, which includes the having mode, right? Which includes our shadows, which includes our aggression, which includes our angst and anxiety and our melancholy. It's not to the end of suppressing any of those sort of more negative, more darker emotions, but to be in balance with all of them, which is what Jung said was the ultimate ideal, or the ultimate objective of doing shadow work in the first place.
The same thing is happening in literary studies now that happened in the Middle Ages. People read the same books, they come up with conflicting interpretations of them. Those interpretations reflect their ideologies, and then they argue about them. And so we just have these sort of endless combustions that don't go anywhere, just like the Protestants and the Catholics in the Middle Ages. And so, what my work basically says is, what if we just back out of that? And what if we just do the same thing that science has done? And we focus on the way that stories can empower us, the way the stories can improve our human performance, because that's really why they were created by our ancestors. Our ancestors came to be in a tragic world where they realized their own frailty and insufficiency. They said, how do I cope with this life? How do I find strength in the face of my own mortality? How do I lift myself up when I see so much frailty within myself? I see so much frailty in terms of my capacity for anger, for hate, and also my ability to be damaged, my ability to suffer grief and trauma and loneliness. How do I lift myself up? What tool could help me do that? And so the beginning of that, literature with early scriptures, there's a ton of technologies, as I talk about in my work, that we can actually trace their effects in the brain. And then going beyond that healing work into actually making us into our better selves, empowering us with joy, with creativity, with resilience, with the power to lift up others, and perhaps most importantly, the power to grow, to not stay still, to take on damage and turn that damage around into a source of strength. And so what my work does is my work focuses on how literature does all those things, which all of us know intuitively. All of us have read a book at some time, have read a novel at some time, or watched a movie at some time, or read a poem at some time, and felt healed or uplifted or strengthened. If you have a favorite musician, a favorite artist, a favorite rapper, you'll listen to their lyrics and feel the same thing. But the question has always been how? How is it doing that? And so my work goes into that, but also more powerfully, my work breaks down the technology of literature so you can identify the specific nuts and bolts, the specific blueprints that are having those specific effects. And so that's the work that I do at Project Narrative.
So in Wonderworks, in this book, which I referred to earlier, you list out what you consider 25 inventions, and they basically constitute the chapter structure of the book. And so you examine the manner in which stories do such things as rally courage, or stoke romance, or help control anger, or transcend hurt, or excite curiosity. I'm not going to go through all of them, but to dispense with pessimism and banish despair and heal from grief and decide more wisely. And so in some sense, it's a listing of existential concerns. And so you've broken down narrative in these 25 ways in this book to discuss the major sources of existential concern that plague mankind, and then have put forward the notion that we have stories that surround each of these fundamental concerns that help us understand, verbalize, communicate about, and maybe see a pathway through each of these, in the case of the terrible emotions, each of the terrible emotions, or to foster and develop the ones that are more positive.
I mean, that's exactly right. And even more than that. So, I mean, part of what stories do is they give us a plot, a roadmap out of some of these negative emotions into positive emotions. But even more powerfully, they can actually shape our emotions once we understand how to use them. Certain stories can just build optimism or resilience or courage. So to take the first chapter of the book, which is about courage, Homer's Iliad, this extraordinary work. When you read the Iliad, it makes you feel braver. It makes you feel stronger. And it can do that even when it's not talking about courage, even when it has no message about courage, even when it's talking about, oh, well, how does it do that? Well, Homer, he probably didn't invent this technology, but we don't know who did it before him. So we give Homer credit. Homer realized that when he saw soldiers marching into war, they sang songs. And those songs made them feel braver. Why did those songs make them feel braver? Well, those songs made them feel part of a larger voice. They felt they were bigger than themselves. And on a deep psychological level, they could feel that strength because they knew that even if their individual body died, the voice would carry on. And that's a scientific power of song. We know that to be the case, that when people sing together in choirs, they feel braver, they feel more courageous. And so what Homer did is he said, well, what if I could give you that power of singing without you actually singing? What if I could create a technology, a way of writing so that it tricked your brain into thinking that you were singing as part of a choir? And that's, of course, what the Iliad does. It makes you believe that you are listening to the song of a god, sing goddess of the anger. That's how it begins. And it uses all these tricks and techniques, which I go through in the book, into making your brain believe that you are singing as part of this larger chorus. And so when you simply read the book, it makes you feel braver. And that technology...
Well, that idea that you had there, that that group singing unites you with the central voice whose existence transcends death. I mean, there's a very deep religious-like idea in there that's implicit, right? That there is a voice and there are words that unite and transcend and that supersede death. And so that's part of that heroic pattern, I suppose, that Homer is referring to, that you can step into as an active agent in engaging in this literature. Just like when you walk into a movie and you embody the heroes or the anti-heroes sometimes that you see on the screen and experience the emotions that they experience, for better or for worse, as I suppose as a form of practice.
That's exactly right. And, one of the things that is distinct about the Homeric gods is they're large humans. Homeric gods, unlike some sort of an extreme Gnostic version of God, as the Via Negativa or something that is completely non-human and that we can't access, these Homeric gods are essentially heroes in the sense of just being bigger versions of us. And so they're gripped with all the same problems that we have, all the same frailties that we have, jealousy, rage, insufficiency. And so when you join with them in this bigger voice, just as you would in a hero in a movie, you feel that you are becoming yourself only greater. You don't feel like you're losing yourself, but you're joining this bigger thing that is yourself, that makes you bigger, that makes you more powerful. And that's where the spiritual experience comes from. And absolutely, one of the basic primordial experiences of literature, which is so basic, I don't even include it as one of the technologies in the book, I just talk about it in the introduction, is spiritual experience. We can actually detect you having deactivation in your parietal lobe as you have what's known as a self-transcendent experience, in which you feel the boundaries of yourself and the world dissolving, between yourself and the world dissolving. And that's associated with increased life purpose, increased generosity and kindness, because you no longer have the same sense of ego. You feel connected to others. And that sense of spiritual, I mean, the word literature and the word scripture are synonyms. They mean that which is writ. And so if there's one fundamental thing, more fundamental even than any of the technologies I talk about, to get from literature, it simply is that sense of spiritual experience. And I do think that that is the basic and most powerful experience that any of us can have in this world, because it makes us not only stronger and more purposeful in ourselves, but kinder to others. And really, that's ethics, to be stronger in yourself and kinder to others.
Right, to be more effective and more useful socially, broadly. So, okay, I want to ask you a couple of things. I've done a lot of thinking about narrative. When I read this book back in the 1980s, The Neuropsychology of Anxiety by Jeffrey Gray, and that book had a tremendous impact in the field of psychology, although it took about 20 years before people, I suppose, incorporated at least some of what Gray had proposed. And he got a lot of his ideas, although I didn't know it at the time, from Norbert Wiener, I don't know how to say his name, a brilliant cybernetician who worked on establishing what might be the basis of intelligent abstraction, and so that it could be mechanized. And so I read Gray at the same time and learned about his association with Wiener and cybernetics, and at the same time that I was reading a lot of analytical psychology, mostly by Jung and his students. And I started to understand that the basic cybernetic mechanisms that Gray was discussing as characteristic of cognitive processing seemed to me to be the same thing as the fundamental elements of a story. So let me run this by you, and you tell me what you think about this, okay? We'll see how our thinking is meshing, perhaps, and differing. So I thought that there are basically two types of stories in a functional sense. There's a simple story, and there's a story about how stories transform. And a story itself is actually the frame of reference that we use to perceive the world and act within. So I don't think we have I don't think we think, and then we think in stories as a subset of thinking. I think that the story is the frame for our thought, and that frame is actually what produces our motivation and our emotions. And so a lot of this is, again, influenced by this cybernetic work that was developed by Gray, and his tremendous knowledge of animal behavior and cognition, because he was an absolute genius. I think he cited 2,000 papers in the Neuropsychology of Anxiety. It took me like 6 months to read that book and understand it. It's really dense. So imagine that in the simple story, you mentioned literature as a story, as a map. And I think that's the fundamental issue. So we're always somewhere. That's our starting point. And we're always moving somewhere else because we're active creatures. And we have an image of the destination in mind. And so we segregate up time and space into a functional unit that defines the geographical and temporal bounds of our current operations, and we specify a target. And even when our imagination is free-floating, partly what we're doing is playing with different spatio-temporal frames of reference. So we might be playing with 10 minutes, we might be playing with an hour, we might be playing with a day, we might be playing with 2 weeks. We can expand and contract that more or less at will. But so the map covers a spatio-temporal domain. Okay, and then the goal is specified, and then we feel positive emotion when we see any indication from the environmental feedback that our actions are moving us towards the goal. And we feel, and that's technically positive affect because it's associated with forward movement, left hemisphere activation, dopaminergically mediated. So we can conceptualize the goal abstractly, interestingly enough, and we have to do that because we can play with these spatio-temporal frames of reference. And then if we see a pathway to the goal, a clear pathway that we can implement behaviorally, then that fills us with positive emotion. If we see obstacles in the way, then that induces negative emotion and stops us. And when we stop, we'll play around with the spatiotemporal framing, making it smaller, maybe we have to deal with the next minute, or larger, trying to reconceptualize the territory so that we can continue our movement forward. Okay, so that's story number one, simple story. I was here, I went there, and here's how I got there. And you might want to listen to that because maybe you're there and you want to get to the goal and you need directions. Okay, the next story is different. It's the transformation of stories. And so it's the typical fall or paradise rekindled story. So you have a frame of reference. You're moving towards a goal. Something that isn't modeled within that frame of reference occurs. It's like an alien invader in some sense. It doesn't make sense from within that current frame of reference. It blows the frame of reference into pieces. You enter a land of, in some sense, of narrative fragments. That's the underworld in mythology. You have to sort those narrative fragments up and rebuild them, remap the territory, and then you build another story. So that's a meta story. It's a story about how a story can decompose, collapse into catastrophe, and rekindle itself. And it seemed to me that there isn't anything more basic to our abstract thinking than that sort of nesting inside of stories.
First of all, I completely agree on the overall point. So, I actually have a book coming out next year on Columbia University Press, and the title is Story Thinking, because basically my belief is that human cognition is largely narrative, and that actually we process the world narratively. In this exact way. And this is actually what makes our brain function different from computers and AI. Whether or not computers and humans can do the same tasks, we do them differently. Computers think in these kinds of logical correlational sequences, and humans, to your point, think in plots and plans and narratives and goals. And those plots and plans are then associated with emotions, because a computer exists in the mathematical present tense, so it cannot have desire. There's nothing missing to a computer because it's always in the same place all the time. It's always the equal sign of the mathematical present tense. But we as the humans are able, through plotting and planning, to imagine a future that is distinct from the present, which creates desire or fear or hope or all these other emotions. And so narrative and emotion just go together completely in human experience. And, that's why emotions are both shaped through narrative, but narratives are also shaped through emotion. So, the kind of simple thing is to say, well, we can use narratives to influence people's emotions. This is the sort of thing that, is a somewhat, sometimes positive, but often a kind of cheap political trick. You're trying to scare people or manipulate them into doing things and whatnot. But the real power here is to say, first of all, how can I shape my own emotions with narrative? What emotions? In other words, I'm not trying to shape your emotions. I'm trying to shape my own emotions. I'm trying to control my own anger or increase my own hope. How do I do that? By retelling my own stories in my own head. And then the second factor of that is, how can my emotions come into play and enable my narratives? How can I develop the emotional resilience to be more likely to carry on my own story? How can I complete my story, even though I have these obstacles in front of me? And to me, the function of literature, so literature is related to stories, but slightly different in the fact that literature is really the kind of experimental zone where you're pushing the envelope. Literary writers are people who are somewhat dissatisfied to kind of, talk, to think about how you're talking about stories breaking. They're dissatisfied with the stories they have, they're not working, and they say, how can I take these stories and somehow make them new? How can I innovate them? How can I go beyond the stories that I've inherited? How can I push that envelope? And so really what I do in the book is say, here's 25 examples of how stories were broken and then put back together again, and how this technology, just like, any technology that humans have developed, has been expanded and innovated over time to go beyond that simple, I just have to get to this goal story, which I agree with you, is that, that's a fundamental story, beginning, end, the most basic unit, beginning, end, and I find myself in the middle. But, the wonder of being on this earth is that there is this possibility to tell our own story, and beyond that, to build stories that we can hand on to other people to empower them to tell their own stories. And it all goes back to this sense of dynamism that you're talking about. and also these emotions that you're talking about.
And to unite us in a collective story so that we can work cooperatively together towards the same ends, right? So that we all come under the same banner in some sense. And that's that shared intentionality that's very specifically human. You don't see that much manifest itself much in other animals. Even the higher apes have a hard time with it compared to us.
Absolutely, yes. And what's really important about that is that it's ultimately voluntary. Because again, if we brainwash people to have the same story as us, that's to me a biological no-go. It's not particularly effective and it's unethical. But if we find a story that's so compelling that when we share it with someone else, that empowers them and then they join our story, we are most happy when we do not perceive ourselves as inheriting an archetypal story from somebody else. If I were to say to you, here's the archetypal story, you're going to end up back there, that would be disinteresting to us emotionally. We want to tell our own stories. We want to be particular in ourselves. I would also say that even though human psychology has remained relatively constant for at least 300,000 years, and parts of it for over 1 million, our world is changing and has changed. And there are real differences between the way the world works now, the kinds of actions and behaviors that are going to function now than there was even 500 years ago. And so there is this need for flexibility in narrative. So even as what you're talking about, I think, Jordan, is this fundamental spiritual component of narrative, the way in which narrative can connect us with the eternal, a sense of things bigger than ourselves, and that transcendent sense of purpose is what lifts us. But narrative also has this flexibility outside the spiritual, in the material world, to say, okay, how do I navigate this challenge? I'm not going to navigate this challenge as Luke Skywalker or Christ, because Luke Skywalker and Christ didn't encounter it.
Okay, I don't think it's abstracted outside of the spiritual. I think this relates to the issue of the relationship between the conscious propositions and the unconscious understructure. So I think that we think in stories, we frame the world in stories, we see in stories, and this is partly why, for example, our eyes are adapted with the whites of our eyes so that other people can see our eyes. It's really important for us to see other people's eyes because we can see where they're pointing their eyes. And if we can see where they're pointing their eyes, we can see what they're interested in. We can see what they value, and we can instantly infer their motivation. And that makes them predictable. And and it's so important that all of our ancestors whose eyes weren't that visible either didn't mate or got killed. It's really important. Okay, so we have now this shared narrative. So imagine this perhaps relates to the particular and the absolute. As you specify the narrative for small scale actions, and those would be particularized, the connection with the absolute, the larger absolute, in some sense falls away, but it's nested. So you could say, if you're an integrated person, it's nested. It's so like right now you're you're listening to me, and sometimes you're talking to me. Okay, so, and the story there is, well, we want to have an engaging conversation. And why? Well, there's a bigger story outside of that because we want to further our knowledge about narrative and we want to share that with other people. And then there's a story outside of that, which is, well, why? Well, because we're both educators and public communicators. Well, why bother with that? Well, because we think education, rationality, and narrative are important for the proper functioning of human beings. Well, why is that relevant? Because we care about the emotional experience of people and we want to further their growth because we want things to be better. And what's outside of that? Well, it's something like the idea that truthful and engaged exploration is a high value. And then outside of that, well, at some point you get to the ultimate abstraction, right? Which is the ultimate good. And if you're an integrated person, the particular of your action is associated with that broad scale abstraction, but you don't have to refer to it in the moment. And thank God for that.